Welcome to Lifestyle Solopreneur, the community for entrepreneurs who put lifestyle first. Join your host, Flavia Barris, as she interviews successful lifestyle solopreneurs and shares ideas to help you find the perfect balance between lifestyle, business, and self. Flavia is an attorney, marketing expert, and founder of several online academies. She's been featured in major media, including BBC World News, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Post, ESPN Television, and more. Join us for this episode of Lifestyle Solopreneur.
Hey, Lifestyle Solopreneurs. Today we get to speak with Perry Marshall. He is one of the most expensive business strategists in the world. He is endorsed in Forbes and INC Magazine and has authored 10 books. That's right, 10 books. At London's Royal Society, he announced the world's largest science research challenge, which was the $10 million Evolution 2.0 prize. His reinvention of the famous Pareto Principle is published in Harvard Business Review, and his Google book laid the foundations for the $400 billion digital advertising industry. He has a degree in engineering, and he lives with his family in Chicago. Welcome to the show, Perry.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So good to have you here. And there's something we chatted about briefly before, but I want to dive into it a little bit more. It's about coffee shops. But again, for anyone listening, Perry does not own a coffee shop, but I love your thoughts on coffee. But before we do that, tell us a little bit about how you ended up where you are today. I know you're this business strategist known throughout the world, but I'm sure you weren't born that way. What was your journey to get to where you are today?
When I was 26, I had a job as an acoustical engineer and I got laid off. And my wife was 3 months pregnant. And our plan was for her to stay home and be a mom. And so I had to scramble really fast. And I couldn't find anything in engineering that matched my requirements. And so I went into sales. And I remember one of my friends saying, Perry, you don't just stick a pencil behind your ear and make a major career change. I'm like, I don't know. I met a lot of those sales guys. They don't seem to be all that smart. And I was in for 2 years of bologna sandwiches and ramen soup and spiraling credit card debt and pounding the phone and pounding the pavement. And after a couple of years of agony, I discovered direct marketing. And that coincided with when the internet was really just starting to come on. And in a couple of years, I really turned my life around. And I also got a clue about sales. And that led to me being an author and a consultant and somebody who has a lot of empathy for startup entrepreneurs who are scrapping and have to put groceries on the table while getting a business to work.
That's where a lot of entrepreneurs find themselves at some point in their journey, right? Is struggling. And that's why I love this podcast, because we can be a community and learn from each other and not just learn from each other's success, but also mistakes. But first, talk to me about coffee, because let's talk about what is the purpose of a coffee shop. I know I love coffee shops. I am someone who can spend a nice hour just leisurely, especially if the coffee shop is the right one. There's some where you walk in and it's just hissing noises from machines and people yelling out order numbers, and they've gotten rid of all the tables because they did that during COVID and never put them back. And not those, but there's some really nice mom and pop coffee shops where I can spend a good 2 hours. But you sometimes say the point of that coffee shop is not to sell coffee. So talk to me about that.
So 80-20 says that 80% of your business wants to, intends to, and will come from 20% of your customers. And then you can rinse, repeat. And so really 50% of your money wants to come from 1% of your customers. So if customers are coming in and buying lattes, how is 1% of them going to give you that much money? It's only possible if you sell them something expensive. And so if you look at the economics of a coffee shop, selling the lattes and the black teas only keeps the lights on. It doesn't produce any profit. And all of the profit comes from the upper end sales from a very tiny percentage of customers that want to spend a lot of money. And this is exactly why if you walk into Starbucks, you'll find a $2,700 espresso machine. And it's essentially a law of physics that most of your profit is going to come from a very small number of people. And in fact, your business should be designed to do that. And most successful businesses do not make their money the way people think they do. McDonald's doesn't really make any money selling burgers and fries. McDonald's is in the real estate business. And the money in McDonald's is in the appreciation of the real estate of the locations that they have. And most businesses are like this. And so that is to say, business is almost never in reality what it appears to be on the surface.
It's fascinating. And you mentioned the 80-20 principle, the Pareto Principle. Talk to us about that. When were you first introduced to it, and how has it impacted your work?
So most people have heard of this. And I heard about this a long time ago when I was a young sales guy. And I read in some book, it said 80% of your business comes from 20% of your clients, and 20% comes from the other 80%. And I thought, is that right? That doesn't sound right. Could that be true? And I printed out a QuickBooks statement and I went through it with a calculator. I went from the top to the bottom and I just added it up, and I'll be darned, it's true. When I get through the top 20% of the purchase orders, that's 80% of the money. And then I didn't really think about it anymore, which is to say I didn't get it. I didn't really understand what it was saying. And a few years later, I was reading Richard Koch's famous book, The 80-20 Principle, and he just happened to mention that 80-20 had a lot to do with chaos theory, which is the branch of science that deals with things like earthquakes and landslides and cracks in windshields and things like that. And I thought, whoa, wait a minute. I think what he's really saying is that this is a law of nature. It's not just a business rule of thumb. That was exactly right. And I jumped up in that. I was in a coffee shop, by the way, when I read that, as I like coffee shops too. And I ran home. And at this point, I had been in business for a year and a half. And I'm sure you and all of your listeners know exactly what it's like to have been in a business for a year and a half out of the Dilbert cube. It's still wobbly, it's working, but you can't afford to make any slips, and you've been hustling. And I looked at how many visitors to my website, how many people fill in a form, how many people buy something, how many clients do I have, how much do these clients spend with me? And it just blew my mind. I'm like, wait a minute, this is all 80-20 of the top, from top to the bottom. Not only is it 80-20, there's a top 20% inside the top 20% that generates 80% of the 80%. And there's a top 20 of the top 20 of the top 20 that produces 80 of the 80. Oh my word. How come
Like
no?
death.
Yes, it's like a snake that eats its own tail. How did nobody ever tell me this ever in my life before now? And it set my mind on fire. And all of a sudden, I saw it everywhere. So I went home, I looked at all my numbers. Yep, I can use this to predict the future. I can use this I could walk into a coffee shop and I could look at all of their receipts. And if they're not getting 80% of their business from 20% of the customers, they're doing something wrong. And they need to obey this law of nature. And so I started deploying this. Like the following Monday, I sent a memo to my biggest client. I said, we're going to do an 80-20 analysis of this entire business. And we're going to figure out. So we started doing things like, so I'll tell you an example. This client back then, they were renting, I think, 16 mailing lists and mailing out 1 million catalogs a year to all these people. And I said, I guarantee you 80% of the money is coming from 20% of those mailing lists, but you don't know who they are. And we devised a test to figure out which of those lists were more responsive. And we chopped 16 mailing lists down to 5. And they started making more money mailing 250,000 catalogs than they would send 250,000 catalogs twice a year instead of 1,000,000 catalogs once a year. And they made more money. And they cut the postage and printing in half. That's what 80/20 does.
You reinvented the Pareto Principle, and it was published by the Harvard Business Review. What was that article about, or how was it reinvented? I'm very curious.
So it was about the fact that 80/20 is fractal. And so a fractal is a pattern inside a pattern. So a tree is fractal. You look at a tree across the street and you see the branching pattern, but you could walk right up to it, look at the branches, and then you could pick off a leaf and look at the leaf under a microscope. And in the microscope, you'll still see the branching pattern inside the leaf. That's what fractal means. And what I suddenly realized, and this was the epiphany in the coffee shop, 80/20 is fractal. There's another one inside another one inside another one, and it keeps going until you're literally down to one person, or one product defect, or one customer, or one product, or one employee. And now I found some like old academic papers from the 70s that did talk about this. Nobody was explaining this to business people. Nobody was writing it in business books. Nobody was talking about it. And like we talked about espresso machines, and I created an espresso machine calculator. It's at 8020curve.com, and the 80/20 book explains how to use it. And it will tell you if you had 790 people spend $4.50 on a latte, tell me exactly how many people are going to buy a $2,000 espresso machine, and it will be right plus or minus 15%. It's almost scary how accurate it is. And it applies to everything. It applies to traffic in the roads in your town. So in your town, 80% of the traffic is on 20% of the roads, and 50% of the traffic is on 1% of the roads. And it's true in every town. And it's true of tax revenues, and it's true of spreadsheets and Facebook campaigns and Google campaigns and lattes and espresso machines and all of these things, rabbit populations and the size of craters on the moon. And I reframed everything I did and taught about marketing around 80/20, and it made it easier to understand why anything works.
I'm almost reluctant to ask an engineer this. Is math really the fabric of our existence? Because it's so interesting that all these patterns exist and they're statistical and mathematical. And for anyone that already has an affinity for all things math or comes from that kind of engineer brain side, this is really exciting stuff. Other people's eyes might glaze over if they hate math and they hate patterns and kind of logic games, but this is exciting.
We're speaking to the geeks in the room. Let's not be shy about it. But there is a obscure verse in the Catholic Bible. It's not even in the Protestant Bible. The Catholics have a book called Wisdom of Solomon. And there's a verse in there that says, "Thou hast ordered all things in weight and number and measure." And it was probably written in 200 BC. And it's the first statement in literature that I know of that describes what we would today understand as a scientific view of the world. And so one thing about most business people is that they do care about numbers. They may not be numbers people, they may not be physicists or any crazy thing like that, but they think about numbers. And to a good business person and a marketer, a person is not a number, but every number is a person.
Wow. You're quite
And
prolific as an author. Oh, go ahead.
and and 80% of the people read 20% of my books. And so it's so predictable. And it's really a great relief when you find out that the world is not as random and accidental as maybe you thought it was. That there, even in the things that you try the hardest to understand and seem most mysterious, I promise you there's a pattern there that most people are missing. But once you get it, oh, this isn't so hard after all. Haven't you had that experience yourself?
I think we all have. Absolutely. For you, you're someone that not only has all these great ideas and you think things through, but you manage to do the sort of holy grail for a lot of aspiring authors and writers, which is you've published not just one book, multiple books, not just multiple books, but as far as I know, I think you have 10 books out. So, how are your ideas boiled down into these books? Tell us a little bit about your process and your motivation for getting these words on paper. And I will also ask you to, this is hard for an author, but talk to us about which of your 10 books is your favorite. I know it's like asking someone, what's your favorite kid? But if you were to tell someone, okay, if you're going to read my books, start with this one, which one would it be?
I want to start by saying there's an old saying, it's not hard to teach what was hard for you to learn. I don't think sales came easily to me. In fact, I can prove to you from my tax returns and my early career, it did not come easy to me. Like my first sales job, I had it for 2 years. I got fired after 2 years because heavy cloud, no rain, heavy cloud, no rain. Boy, looks good. Nothing's happening. And it was a really bitter struggle. And I don't know if I'm just stubborn or if I'm too much of an engineer or just what the problem was. But I had to try a lot of different things before I found stuff that worked for me. And I would listen to all kinds of motivational programs and I had tapes in my car and all the time. And I was just trying to learn all the time, but it just never seemed to click. And there were a lot of things that there were there were a lot of things that served somebody else's purpose that didn't really serve mine. There are a lot of products that just don't deserve to be sold. There are a lot of products that no salesman deserves to have to flog because they're not worth your time. You shouldn't sell a product that's a Me Too product that's just like six other brands that all do the same thing, especially when your brand is like the number 3 or 4 player in the market. That's not David versus Goliath. That's just stupid. But I didn't know that. I was naive. And so I had to learn like a product has a unique selling proposition. There has to be something about that product that's unique and does something different than anybody else's product. And you shouldn't be selling a Me Too product, even if you are a brand new person or even if you are inexperienced. You might as well have your first experiences doing something that has a chance of succeeding. So you asked me about my books, and boy, it depends on, let's restrict this to business because I have a science book too. But I think my 2 favorite business books are 80/20 Sales and Marketing. I've built a whole career out of that. And it gives people a revelation. Like when you read that book in 80/20, you will never not see it again. It will change what you see when you look out the window. You could look out the window and somebody would say, so show me the 80/20s. And a person who read that book could rattle off 10 of them just looking out their window. And most people wouldn't be able to do that. But if you've read that book, you can do that. The other book that I really is called Memos from the Head Office. And Memos from the Head Office is a book of stories of people who got, you could call it God, you could call it the muse, you could call it the universe, but they needed answers and they got an answer to a problem that just materialized or popped into their head in an almost miraculous way. And Everybody who reads that book says, oh, yeah, I have had this happen to me before. I just didn't have language for it. And I'm really proud of that book too. In fact, I thought it would be controversial because it's basically a religious book, but it has the best stars of any book that I have. It's got 4.9 stars on Amazon. I don't even know if there's any bad reviews, which astounds me. I thought somebody would get hacked off or offended or something, but that's not what happened.
Love, I can't wait to read those books. They sound amazing. Tell us a little bit about how you would describe what your career is today, because a lot of people listening, they might be stuck in a job, maybe they're that sales job that you had way back when, or they're just unhappy, might be feeling trapped, maybe just ready for a change, ready to be their own boss or do something different. How would you describe your career path? Obviously, no one's going to be exactly you. They're not going to reinvent the 80/20 principle or teach exactly what you teach or do exactly what you do. But you're in this like knowledge industry. You're basically making a living from what's between your ears. So tell us a little bit about what that career path looks like.
Let me tell you a story from when I was a sales rep. I'm probably 4 or 5 months into my first sales job after I got laid off as an engineer. And I'm pounding the pavement. And we went to a trip to one of the manufacturers that we represented because I was a rep. And so we walk in the door and we sit down in the conference room with all of the staff members of this manufacturer. And I said, hi, I'm Perry. I'm an electrical engineer. And my boss immediately corrected me. He goes, Perry is a sales guy. Sometimes he forgets what his job is. Bonked me on the head in front of everybody. And when you're 26 years old, you say, thank you, sir, may I have another? You don't really argue, especially if you want to keep your job. Why did I say, hi, I'm Perry, I'm an electrical engineer? Because I thought what I wanted to communicate to these people was, I'm not just a backslapping, joke-telling sales guy who looks at the fish on your wall and tells you golf stories. I actually know something. But my boss didn't want somebody who knew something. He wanted a backslapping, joke-telling sales guy who would just go pick up some orders somewhere. And like I said, I got fired from that job. And what I realized, learned the hard way was I've got to find a way to sell that fits who I am. And I need to sell a product that's unique and special that probably requires some extra knowledge and nuance and insight in order to use. And there's lots of products like that out there. There's lots of products that aren't just going to jump off the shelf and into the person's shopping cart and say, see, this is how you use me. I needed to sell something that only a knowledgeable person could sell. And that's what I've done my entire career. And the way that I think this applies to anybody listening, whoever you are, whether you identify with my specific story or not, whatever you do, it has to be consistent with who you are. And you can't just, isn't there like an old Greek story about a guy who, if the guest's legs hang over the edge of the bed, he just chops them off. And then if they're too short for the bed, he puts them on a rack and stretches them out. Like
Oh
that's
no,
a
but new fear unlocked.
that story is that's an important story because there's all kinds of people that will chop off your legs if they're too long or put you on a rack and stretch you if you're too short. And they're just going to fit you into whatever box they've got. And if there was ever a time in history where you should be able to find a place where you can grow and be you, it should be now. We're past the age of the industrial age of mass production and factories and all of that. And people want and need things that are customized to their needs. And only people that understand that kind of person knows how to make something like that. And if you're in a dead end job, or if you're in a career that you hate, or if you're in a business you're tired of, then go ahead and reinvent yourself. And believe me, I've had to invent myself over and over again. I've actually become quite good at it. And I want to reassure you that if you're reinventing yourself and you're uncomfortable, that is normal, it's to be expected, and it's okay.
So I love that all of our guests here at Lifestyle Solopreneur are very generous in giving something of value, not just their time on the episode and sharing their wisdom, but we always say, is there anything that you want to offer to the audience? And you have something, you've provided a direct link to it. I'll let you tell about that link. And then we also keep all of these, I call it in our vault. And it's at podcastguestgift.com, where we collect everything of value that our listeners are being offered by all of our guests. But tell us a little bit about what that is and where people can go to get that directly. And again, anyone, if you want to access gifts from other guests, you can go to podcastguestgift.com.
So if you go to perrymarshall.com/podcast, we have a couple of things that you can grab. One of them is an 80/20 quiz, and it's free, and it asks you a series of questions. And after you answer those questions, it will tell you how much upside there is in your life that you can access by being more aware of the top 20% levers in your life. And it it covers sales and marketing and time management and opportunity management. And then my book, 80/20 Sales and Marketing, you can buy it for $7, including shipping in the United States. If you're outside the United States, you can buy it directly from us. It'll save you about $15 compared to Amazon, and we'll give you a couple extra videos. And that is the $7 book that will change your life forever, because the big doors of the world swing on tiny little hinges. Those hinges are huge levers. And when you have the ability to recognize hinges, it is a total game changer. You will never do entrepreneurship or sales or marketing the same after you see the 80/20 hinges. So that's at perrymarshall.com/podcast.
Thanks, Perry. And any final thoughts today for listeners to inspire and motivate them to achieve whatever's next for them on their big list of goals?
We just got done with Thanksgiving, and one memory I always have at Thanksgiving is when I got fired from my sales job after 2 years. It was immediately before the Thanksgiving break. And so I had just lost this job, and I picked up a new job. I got a job offer over the phone to start right after Thanksgiving break. And so I was straddling two jobs. And we went to Nebraska to spend, where our family is from, to spend Thanksgiving. And I was riding in a pickup truck with my brother-in-law, and his son also had gotten an engineering degree just like me. And he says to me, "Harry, you and Laura are struggling and it doesn't seem like you're doing all that. Is things going to be okay for my son when he gets out of school?" And I go, "Brad, I've taken a lot of risks and I've taken a lot of side trips in my career, and it's going to be fine for him." But of course, I'm grimacing and I'm just trying to endure being ashamed of how much I'm struggling. And when I when I accepted the job that was coming immediately after, I had a feeling that job was going to work out, and it did. And one of the things that I started to learn around that period in my life was you can pay attention to your gut and your body and the sensations that you have in your body when you're making decisions. And usually your body is right. And before that, I'd lived inside my head and learned to ignore a lot of those signals. And I was getting to a point where it was time to switch all that circuitry back on and start paying attention and being a whole human being instead of just living inside my head. And so I want to encourage people when you're entertaining opportunities, when you're in sales situations, when you're at a crossroads, you really can listen to the signals in your very finely tuned, highly evolved machine that you live in called a body, and don't ignore it. You'll make much better decisions that way.
Words of wisdom to live by, for sure. Perry, it's been so nice chatting with you today. Absolutely love learning about what you're up to, your books you've written. And the Pareto Principle for me is something I've known about for a long time, but I have never, ever been privy to this knowledge that it's not just 80-20 and it just goes deeper and deeper, like in this spiral, downwards and downwards, and you can just chase that down. And I love that you can get all the way to one person before you come to the end of that pathway. So thank you for sharing all of that knowledge. It's been super interesting. Absolutely love everything we've chatted about.
Flavia, thank you for having me. And this has been a fun conversation. Appreciate it.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, and if you leave a review on iTunes, I promise I will read every single review. If you know someone who makes a full-time living from part-time work, and maybe this is you, please visit lifestylesolopreneur.com to nominate a guest or to nominate yourself. Because remember this, money doesn't buy happiness, but money in the hands of a happy person, there is no greater tool.
Today's episode was brought to you by the Get Shift Done program. It's a lifestyle-changing online class to help you define your business and lifestyle ambitions and to set goals in a way you've never experienced before. This class will 10x your daily productivity with methods that will blow your mind. And if you use the coupon code podcast, the class tuition is 99% off. Visit GetShiftDone.com to enroll today.